All right, this is segment number one. Remember, we are on seed plants, and there are two major divisions of seed plants. That includes the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. This segment will cover the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms, really, this means naked seeds, and why they're nicknamed naked seeds because the seeds are exposed on the sporophylls that form the cones on these types of plants. The gymnosperms are cone-bearing plants, and the most common group is the conifers. So here we can see the phylogeny. Remember, the non-vascular plants include the bryophytes, and then we have the seedless vascular plants. Remember, non-vascular plants are also seedless plants. And then we have the gymnosperms and angiosperms, which show here as sister groups, which really isn't the most accurate description of their phylogeny or the relationship between each other. However, based on this, relatively speaking, they did diverge at some point. Now, we're going to go through the individual groups of the gymnosperms, and there are four of them. But let's talk about the background first. Seed plants have dated back to the Devonian, which was about 380 million years ago. In fact, Archaeopteryx was basically a heterosporous. So this is where we have actually have evidence of heterospory and woody stems. However, it didn't have seeds. So during that time, probably the Devonian, about 300 million years ago, there were no seeds. However, some of the characteristics of gymnosperms were starting to evolve. Later on, at about 360 million years ago, at least we have some evidence of a fossil from the genus Elkinsia, which provides evidence that there were seeds. And you can see an ovule right here. So this is one example of an organism that provides evidence where seeds might have appeared around 360 million years ago. So eventually, gymnosperms and those seed plants became the dominant vegetation, and it's because they had seeds. So remember, prior to the existence of seed plants, there were the seedless plants, and remember, they needed more water and wet environments in order to reproduce because their sperm had flagella. Now, over time, during the Carboniferous, the conditions became a lot drier, so this favored the gymnosperms because they had seeds. And also, the gymnosperms ultimately served as food for the dinosaurs that ate plants, the herbivorous dinosaurs. And we do also have evidence of pollination. So, recent discoveries of fossils show that gymnosperms were pollinated by insects. And we already kind of know that that happens now, but over 100 million years ago, it occurred, right? So you can see an old fossil of an insect with pollen grains on its back. Talk about the life cycle of the pine. So we saw an example of pollination. Part of the life cycle of a pine is pollination. But let's just talk about the key characteristics of the gymnosperm life cycle. Remember, we did talk about the trend towards the miniaturization of the gametophytes. This is actually seen, of course, in the pine. Also, they are seed plants, so they produce seeds, and this is the dispersible stage during the life cycle. And also pollination, which is basically the transfer of the sperm from the pollen to the ovules. All right, so the pine tree, as I mentioned before, is the entire sporophyte. So you can see that the sporophyte is the dominant stage of the life cycle in these types of plants. The sporophyte produces the sporangia, and these sporangia are going to be in the male and female cones. So there's two types of cones here. We have female cones, which are a little bit larger. Those are called the ovulate cones. And I've kind of color-coded the male and female parts, pink or blue and pink, respectively. The male cones are a lot smaller, and those are often called or nicknamed the pollen cones. Let's look at the pollen cone first, and then we'll look at the ovulate cone. So the pollen cone, you can see the sporangia, or the microsporangia, of course. Remember, they're prefixed micro because they are the male structures. Inside each of the microsporangia, we can see we have one microsporangium here. There are what's called microsporocytes. So those are diploid cells that are going to undergo meiosis to cells, right? And these haploid cells are called the pollen grains. So that's the pollen, and that's what's actually dispersed. So again, these are very small cones, and they're going to produce the microspores, which are actually the pollen grains. And they're produced by meiosis of the microsporocytes. Now, looking at the ovulate cone and the pregnation, let's go ahead and take a little closer look. So in the ovulate cone, we have the ovules, right? So again, these are still exposed seeds, and we haven't got to the seed stage yet, but we're going to talk about the development of the seed. Now we have, this is the megasporocyte, which is in each of the ovules in the ovulate cone, and surrounded by the megasporangium. And again, this is all part of the sporophyte, right? So this is the sporophyte stage, it's diploid. However, the megasporocyte is going to undergo meiosis to eventually produce the, well, there's going to be one surviving megaspore, which will be basically the egg. Now, this kind of already shows pollination starting. Now, it can take nearly 3 years for a pine to actually, after fertilization, to develop into a seed. So, let's go ahead and take a look at pollination. Remember, the pollen is going to enter the micropyle and then induce the formation of a pollen tube where the sperm nucleus is going to be discharged from the pollen, and then it's going to lead to the egg, and then fertilization occurs. Once fertilization occurs, we have a growing embryo, and starts really the development of a seed. So remember, the megasporangium that surrounds the megaspore is going to serve ultimately as the food source for the growing embryo. It's going to eventually develop into a mature seed, and you can see these seeds right here. These will basically be dispersed very long distances. Now, once it lands, and assuming that it lands in a fertile ground, it will germinate and then develop into a seedling and a full mature sporophyte. Okay, so that kind of takes you through the whole life cycle of a pine. Now, we're going to talk about the life cycle of angiosperms in the third segment, which is very similar to this. However, obviously they're flowering plants. They have quite different structures, but there are a couple other key things that complicate the life cycle of the angiosperms. Now, let's talk about the groups of gymnosperms. There are 4 major phyla of gymnosperms. There are the Cicadophyta, shortened cicads. There's the Ginkgophyta, which only has 1 living species, the Ginkgo biloba. You're probably familiar with that. The Cnidophyta, which have 3 genera, which each of them having several species. And then the Coniferophyta, which are the ones that you're probably most familiar with. And this include the conifers, such as the pine, the fir, and the redwood trees. Now let's see some examples. So here we have the Cicadophyta. You're probably very familiar with these, especially in our tropical climates, because they're found in mainly tropical climates. So they're going to have very, very large cones. You've probably seen these before, and palm-like leaves. Now, what's interesting about the cicads is that they do have flagellated sperms. So again, they need climates that are quite moist, which is typically found in a tropical type of climate. Now, a few of the species here are actually endangered, so they're protected at this point. Now we have the Ginkgophyta. Like I said, the Ginkgophyta only has 1 single species, the Ginkgo biloba. This also has flagellated sperm. So what's interesting about the Ginkgo biloba, it's often used as an ornament or just like decoration, and it has a high tolerance to air pollution. Now we have the Neophyta. Remember, the Neophyta have only three genera. Again, several species will belong to that. They vary very significantly in their appearance. Some of them are more tropical, where others live more in desert-type climates. These have sperm that have no flagella. Okay, so now we're moving into the more trend where the sperm do not have flagella. So, of course, if an organism lives in a desert climate and there's not much water, then of course it wouldn't survive if the sperm had flagella. Now, the final major phylum of the gymnosperms is the Coniferaophyta. You're probably very familiar with those. These are the largest group of plants in this particular group. Most of them have woody cones. Some of them have fleshy cones like the earlier groups. Most of them are evergreens, which means that they can photosynthesize all year. And here are some beautiful examples of the Coniferaophyta. All right, so that kind of summarizes the gymnosperms, the main traits of the gymnosperms, why they're called a gymnosperm. They have naked seeds, meaning that they're exposed on the sporophylls. We talked about the taxa. There are four major groups, and the characteristics of each of those groups. I think we're ready for the angiosperms.